Hi everyone, welcome back to another video. So today's video is on the digestive system, and this covers the human digestive system, with our stomach and our intestines and all of that, but it also covers nutrition and digestion and whatnot for other organisms. So let's get started. So Oops. So first, let's talk about the diet. Why do we eat the things we eat, and why do we have to even eat in the first place? So there's three big purposes. Number one, we have to have chemical energy. This one's pretty self-explanatory. Basically, we have to eat glucose, and that glucose will give us, energy and in the form of ATP. So this is largely true for pretty much any organism. They might be eating different things to get different forms of energy, but still, that is a very big purpose of why we eat. Next is we need organic building blocks. So to build proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, you have to have the building blocks for these. And lastly, we need essential nutrients, and these are nutrients that can't be made in the body. So, for example, essential amino acids, you can remember with this mnemonic right here. And something to pay attention to is histidine is only an essential nutrient for infants, and humans, adult humans don't have histidine as an essential nutrient. And something else to note is animal proteins are complete, whereas plant proteins are incomplete. And basically, what that means is animal proteins have all the amino acids, whereas plant proteins do not have all the amino acids. For instance, corn lacks tryptophan and lysine, beans lack methionine. So there's that. And then there's also essential fatty acids, for example, linoleic acid in mammals. And there's also, vitamins and minerals that fall under this category. And if you want to know more about vitamins, just go back to the channel page and look at the vitamins lesson. All right, so just some more additional stuff. There's the concept of herbivores versus carnivores versus omnivores, basically plant eaters, meat eaters, and a mix of both in one type of organism. And something to note is that animals still tend to be opportunistic feeders, meaning that while they may prefer to, say, only eat vegetation or only eat meat, in the instance that they don't have anything else around, they might still eat something that they don't normally eat. And then dietary deficiencies. So malnutrition is the failure to obtain adequate nutrition. And essentially what happens in your body is you use up carbohydrates until you run out of those, then you go to fats and then proteins, and you really don't want to make it to this point. So fats are more energy heavy than carbs, but they're just harder for your body to access in a way. And proteins have very low energy. They're kind of the last resort, and you really don't want to be using proteins because that can, interfere with the need for proteins in your brain, and it's really, really not good. And deficiencies in organisms are often compensated by consuming concentrated sources of salt, snail shells, stones, etc. So basically, in the cases that you might not get the, nutrition you need from the food you usually eat, certain organisms like, goats or whatnot, living in the mountains, they might not get everything they need from plants. Say they need some salt, so they might go and lick some salt. So, yep. Then now we're going to talk about processing food. So there are 4 stages of processing food, and that's ingestion, digestion, absorption, and elimination. And you can remember this with this mnemonic right here. Sounds kind of like Idaho. So first let's talk ingestion. So here are the different ways you might see ingestion in organisms. So first there is filter feeding, and this is when you strain organisms or food from the surrounding medium. An example is humpback whales, who use a baleen, which is kind of like a comb. They basically swallow a bunch of water, or they get it in their mouth and they filter it, and then they eat all the plankton and whatnot that gets stuck in the baleen. So this is a type of suspension feeding, which is basically when you feed from the suspension the organism is in. So next up is substrate feeding, and this is when you live on or in a food source. So an example is a leaf miner caterpillar, which is born on a oak leaf and eats through the oak leaf. And another example is maggots, which burrow into carcasses. And then is fluid feeding, and this is when the organism sucks fluid from a living host. So we might be familiar with this because, mosquitoes in the summer or, something like that. So an interesting example out of these is aphids. So they tap phloem sap. So you might be tempted to think of fluid feeding as something that just happened, to animals and to their blood especially, but no, aphids, these little bugs, they actually get sap from plants, and this can cause some diseases like banana bunchy top virus to spread among plants. So that's pretty interesting. It's kind of like how, mosquitoes can spread malaria among humans. And hummingbirds and bees eat nectar, and this is a relationship that also benefits the host since their pollen gets spread. Okay, so next is bulk feeding, and this is what we're most familiar with. So this is when you eat larger pieces of food. This is what we do, along with most animals. And there's a couple of adaptations that, organisms that do bulk feeding use. For example, there's tentacles to capture prey, pincers, claws, venomous fangs, and teeth. And a pretty extreme example of this is with rock pythons. And they swallow their prey whole, and they don't chew, and they digest that prey for 2 weeks. So, that is a pretty extreme example of bulk feeding. All right, so next is digestion, and there's 2 types of digestion to keep in mind. Those are mechanical and chemical digestion. So mechanical is just the chewing and the grinding. So you break food into smaller pieces, and that increases the surface area for chemical digestion to act on. And chemical digestion is enzymatic hydrolysis. Enzymes, kind of break everything down even further, and this makes those bigger molecules that you just chewed up usable to your body. Like your body can't use like a whole chunk of like bread, but it can use say like the carbohydrates and the proteins that you get once you go through these 2 stages of digestion. All right, and then absorption is fairly simple. Cells absorb now small molecules like amino acids and sugars. And then elimination is just when undigested material exits the digestive system. So now let's talk about digestive compartments. So among animals, there is a variety of differences in kind of how complex their digestive system and digestive process is. So intracellular digestion is something that you're going to see in all animals. So, or all organisms. So basically, food vacuoles from phagocytosis or pinocytosis enter the cell, and that gets digested within the cell. And this is the only method used by sponges, which are largely considered to be the simplest animal. And then there's also extracellular digestion, which is used by most animals. So an example of this could be a gastrovascular cavity, which has 1 opening. So basically like a pouch. And this is a very, very simple example. So, an animal that uses this is the hydra. And basically in the hydra, gland cells in the gastrodermis, which lines that gastrovascular cavity, secrete enzymes and engulf particles, and hydrolysis digests said particles intracellularly. And then flatworms, additionally, have a gastrovascular cavity, so this is largely how they operate as well. And then an alimentary canal or a complete digestive tract, which is what humans use, has 2 openings. So here are just some examples of the diversity you will see in digestive compartments. So, each of these parts is having a different function, and so you see that there's like roughly some of the same kind of structures, but they look obviously very different. All right, so now let's talk about digestive organs, and these will be found in mammals. Okay, so first the oral cavity, pharynx, and esophagus. So in the oral cavity, basically your teeth begin to mechanically break down food. Salivary glands secrete mucus, which is water, salts, cells, glycoproteins to lubricate food, buffer pH, and protect against microbes. With something called lysozyme in your saliva, and amylase, which helps kind of break down those carbohydrates as a first step. And in your oral cavity, your tongue evaluates the material you're eating and creates and pushes a bolus, which is basically kind of like a ball of food, and that is what gets sent down to the pharynx, which is the esophagus and trachea. And basically, the esophagus is usually sealed with a contracted sphincter, and when your bolus gets sent down, it triggers a swallowing reflex, and then that causes the larynx to move up and tip the epiglottis down. And that basically covers your windpipe, and then your esophageal sphincter relaxes, and then the food goes down the right way. And then in your esophagus, you have peristalsis, which is basically kind of rhythmic movement of your muscle to send the food down the right way. And this is why even if you're upside down, you can still digest food, without the aid of gravity. And then you make it to another sphincter before you get to your stomach. So now let's talk about digestion in the stomach. So in terms of storage, your stomach does a lot. Got an elastic wall with rugae, which are accordion-like folds, and the whole thing stretches to about 2 liters. And your stomach makes what we call chyme, which is basically a mixture of like digestive juices and food. And in your stomach, that's where you start getting a lot of that chemical digestion. So you have stomach acid, which is hydrochloric acid, with a pH of 2, which is very low, meaning it's really acidic. This disrupts the extracellular matrix of whatever you're eating. So say you're eating a steak, then it's going to basically kind of rip those cells away from their extracellular matrix. It's going to denature proteins. It's going to expose peptide bonds. That's really useful because part of chemical digestion in the stomach is pepsin/pepsinogen. So pepsinogen is basically the inactive version of pepsin. We're going to talk about it when we talk about the cells. So in your stomach, you've got a couple of type of cells. So here are 3 really important ones. Parietal cells are what make hydrochloric acid. They use an ATP pump to expel H plus into the lumen. Cl minus then diffuses into the lumen to make HCl. And this is a really clever method because it essentially allows the cell secreting these things to not get destroyed in the process. Because HCl obviously is going to be very, very violent, I suppose. So yeah. And then chief cells make pepsin, and they first secrete pepsinogen, and then HCl clips off part of it to expose its active site, thus activating it. And then that new pepsin is going to activate more pepsinogen. So the way I like to remember kind of which one of those is which is pepsin cuts proteins, right? So chief cells, C for cut, C for sheaf. So that's just how I think of it. And then finally you have mucus cells, and they produce mucus to protect and lubricate cells. And even still, it's a very kind of corrosive environment in your stomach, and you're going to have a new epithelial layer formed in your stomach every 3 days. And and your stomach churns every 20 seconds to make chyme and move material. All right, so now let's talk about digestion in the small intestine. And this is the first segment of the small intestine, the first of 3, called the duodenum. So your chyme arrives, and then an enzyme called secretin is released, and the pancreas are signaled to release bicarbonate, which neutralizes acidity and acts as a buffer, and trypsin and chymotrypsin, which are enzymes. And then your epithelial lining of the duodenum then secretes more enzymes, and then bile from the gallbladder is secreted to break down fats. And basically, the way they break down fats is bile salts contained in the bile are emulsifiers that kind of make those fats a little more dissolvable in water. And then just some notes. Bile is made in the liver, and it contains bilirubin and biliverdin. And bilirubin is kind of like a stock clue, because it's made from basically dying red blood cells. All right, so now let's talk absorption in the small intestine, and the bulk of this happens in the jejunum and ileum, which are the next two sections. So these places have, these segments have a really, really big surface area, and it's about the surface area of a tennis court, which, if you think about how small your small intestine is, it's pretty wild. So there are very, very large folds, and then there's what we call the brush border, which is basically formed by all of these villi, these little finger-like projections with microvilli, which are even more projections on those villi. So you're going to have a lot of transport into cells, right? To kind of transport all those nutrients into your body. So there's active transport with things like amino acids, small peptides, vitamins, and glucose. There is also passive transport. For example, fructose actually diffuses into cells. And basically the way they get into your blood is there are capillaries in the core of each villus. You can see kind of here. And these lead to the hepatic portal vein, which is essentially a vein that goes from your small intestine to your liver. And at the liver, they are delivered to your heart and then to your organs. And the liver plays a very important role in kind of filtering things out, converts nutrients to other forms, and removes toxic substances. And then, of course, fats are treated a little bit specially. So fat globules are broken down by bile salt, and the resulting fat droplets are hydrolyzed by lipase into fatty acids and monoglycerides. So you can see right here. Basically, they used to be triglycerides like this, and now they are separate. And they are coated with phospholipids, cholesterol, and proteins to make chylomicrons. And see it in this picture right here. And they are exocytosed into a lacteal, which is also in the core of the villus, and it gets delivered to the lymphatic system. So lacteals are part of the lymphatic system. This is kind of a big mem to know, because it's like, oh my gosh, I didn't know that the lymphatic system participated in the digestive system. But yeah. And also, you're going to have lots and lots of water reabsorbed via osmosis in this process. In this whole absorption process. All right, so now let's talk about processing in the large intestine. So the colon basically is where we're going first. It completes water recovery and it starts producing feces. Feces contain cellulose and too little water absorbed in the process means diarrhea, and if feces move too slowly, that's what we call constipation. And then in the colon, bacteria produce methane and hydrogen sulfide. And then we have the cecum, and it's very long in animals that eat plants like koalas, but it's not so long in carnivores and omnivores. And this is because plants are very difficult to digest compared to meat, so we're just going to need a longer digestive system in general when it comes to herbivores. And this is the segment that contains your appendix, if you've ever heard of that before. And then finally, we have the rectum, and this is where feces are stored before elimination. Contractions in the rectum create an urge to defecate, and then there are two sphincters. The inner one is involuntary, the outer one is voluntary. All right, so now let's talk about some evolutionary adaptations with respect to the digestive system. So first are dental adaptations. So carnivores, herbivores, and omnivores are going to have different teeth. Carnivores have large pointed incisors and canines for killing / ripping / cutting, and jagged premolars and molars to crush and shred. So hopefully you see that the pattern here is kind of sharp, killing, ripping. And then herbivores have incisors and canines for biting off vegetation. They might not have canines at all, and they have broad ridged molars for grinding. So very suited for, eating leaves. And then omnivores kind of have a mix. So they have blade-like incisors for biting, pointed canines for tearing, premolars for grinding, and molars for crushing. So yeah, basically the teeth of these animals is kind of suited to what they eat. All right. So there's also stomach and intestinal adaptations. So large expandable stomachs are found in carnivorous vertebrates, and this is because they spend a long time between meals. So essentially, like a lion might hunt, kind of once every 2 weeks, get something to eat. That's going to have to last them, right? So large stomachs really do help with that. And then also in terms of the length, it's longer for herbivores and omnivores, and that's because, like I said, plants are harder to digest. They're going to have a longer cecum and a longer colon. All right, so now let's talk about some mutualistic adaptations. So we're basically talking about a relationship between like microorganisms and other organisms. So bacteria are pretty helpful to us and other organisms because they make vitamins like vitamin K, biotin, folic acid. They regulate the development of the epithelium, of the digestive system, and they can even regulate the function of the immune system. So, now let's talk about in herbivores how we're going to see a lot of these mutualistic adaptations. So obviously you're going to see a large cecum in some of these herbivores like horses, koalas, and elephants. A hoatzin, which is a type of bird, has a large crop, and you're going to see some mutualistic adaptations in the large intestine and cecum of rabbits and rodents who practice coprophagy, which basically means they eat their own poop. And, by doing that, they're able to get even more nutrients out of it. And then kind of the big example here is ruminants. So ruminants, they contain cows and other similar animals, and basically they eat things twice as well. So you might have heard that like cows have like 4 stomachs or something. This is what it's referring to. So basically they are going to eat the grass. It's going to make it through the rumen and the reticulum. In there, the cellulose is going to get digested by microorganisms, and then they're going to regurgitate that, and that is cud. And they chew that cud, and then it makes it back into the digestive system. And then in the omasum, water is removed, and then in the abomasum, there is going to be digestion of that food by the cow's own enzymes. So basically, you see that each of these chambers is pretty highly specialized for certain purposes. In this way, the cow can get, the most out of its food. And just kind of an interesting example here is tube worms and hydrothermal vents get all of their energy from mutualistic chemoautotroph bacteria. So that's like pretty extreme, right? For most organisms, they don't depend on bacteria to that extent, but there's definitely a lot of mutualism going around. Now that we've talked about how food is processed, let's talk about regulation of digestion and hunger and things like that. So here is how digestion is regulated. It is a collaboration between the enteric nervous system, which is basically the nervous system, all those nerves and whatnot inside your digestive system, and the endocrine system, which controls hormones. So when you eat, food is going to stretch the walls of your stomach. That's going to stimulate a hormone called gastrin to be released by the stomach, and it's going to go into the bloodstream and it's going to circulate right back, and that stimulates your stomach to release gastric juices. When that food eventually passes into your duodenum as chyme, your duodenum will release CCK and secretin, 2 hormones. So CCK is going to stimulate the pancreas to release digestive enzymes and the gallbladder to release bile. Secretin is going to stimulate the pancreas to release bicarbonate. So, and if chyme is rich in fats, secretin and CCK will inhibit peristalsis to allow for digestion. So you can kind of see some of those dynamics in this picture right here. And just something else is that humans are going to store their energy as glycogen in the liver, in muscle cells, and as fat in adipose cells. But in general, glycogen is the source we go to first when we're spending energy. So now let's talk about glucose homeostasis. So this is controlled by pancreatic hormones, and these are produced by cells in the islets of Langerhans in your pancreas. So a hormone called glucagon is created by alpha cells, and these release glucose from energy stores into the blood. Insulin by beta cells do the opposite, does the opposite, stimulates uptake of glucose from the blood, and it acts on nearly all cells but brain cells. Your brain cells are kind of special because they can take glucose straight from the blood, and they really don't have to listen to what insulin has to say. So, diabetes mellitus is the deficiency of insulin or a decreased response to insulin. So, something you see in diabetes patients is sometimes is severe diabetic ketoacidosis. This is basically when an over-reliance on fats causes acid metabolites formed during fat breakdown to accumulate, and that lowers the pH of your blood. And another symptom you might see is the excess of glucose that the kidneys can't absorb ends up as sugar in urine, so that can lead to like kind of fruity smelling urine. And there's two types of diabetes. The first one is called type 1 or insulin dependent, and this is autoimmune, where the beta cells are destroyed. This usually appears in childhood, and it's treated with insulin injections because basically what happens in type 1 is you lose the ability to create insulin yourself, but your cells are perfectly responsive to insulin. Type 2 is non-insulin dependent, and this is when target cells fail to respond normally to insulin. It's usually controlled with regular exercise and a healthy diet. Alright, so now let's talk about regulation of appetite and consumption. So, with appetite, your stomach wall is going to secrete ghrelin, and then that makes you hungry. And then more ghrelin is actually present in dieters. And insulin is going to suppress appetite because, it's released after a meal you've already eaten. And adipose tissue, your fat secretes leptin to suppress appetite. And the small intestine secretes something called PYY after meals, which suppresses appetite and counters ghrelin. So you see that there's a lot of hormones going on, kind of at like opposing dynamics, doing opposite things. And overall, a good balance of these will balance out, your hunger and your digestion and things like that. Alright, so that is it for the lesson. I hope this was helpful. Thank you for clicking on this video, and if you would like more content, please subscribe, and if this helped you, please leave a comment and a like. Alright, see you next time.